Chapter 2. Asking Questions to Learn. One who is afraid of asking questions is ashamed of learning. Danish proverb. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 15 says, "The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out." In my early years of mothering, I'd meet Jen at the park. The sandbox repeatedly became the place for me to listen as she talked with the newest stranger in our path. With just a few key questions, Jen would start a conversation, and we would listen to a new friend's story about how she landed in Denver or her latest financial challenge. I used to say Jen could get a wall to talk, but really she has a way of getting people to open up. I'd sit back and listen as she worked her magic. Another friend of mine, Krista, is known for how she makes people feel welcome and comfortable in her presence. I call her the mobile hostess because her welcome mat is with her no matter her location. She has an exceptional way of asking questions that draw others out, and soon they are sharing with vulnerability. Whether she's talking with my children, whom she's known since birth, or with strangers she meets for the first time, questions I wouldn't even think to craft flow right out of her. Once she asks them, I'm immediately intrigued to hear the answers because that's what good questions do. They take the conversation to interesting places. We all likely know people who can get anyone to talk. They draw out stories and details with apparent ease. I've always thought that as extroverts, Jen and Krista were perfect matches for an introvert like me. I didn't have to do the awkward small talk, but could stand next to them and listen in on the conversation, learning about my neighbors. All of these years, I've blamed my introverted nature for my inability to strike up a conversation with someone new. However, I've realized I just don't know how to jumpstart the dialogue. I don't have the art of drawing the other person out, of asking the right questions in a tone that is inviting rather than interrogating. Once a relationship, or even a conversation, is established, in full swing, if you will, my friends feel they can trust me. But how do I love those I casually bump up against so that they feel seen and valued? I believe questions are part of this puzzle, and if I want to love my actual neighbor, I need to develop this skill. In 2 Peter chapter 1, we are told to add to goodness knowledge, or spiritual understanding. A way to add to our knowledge while holding a posture of humility is to ask questions with the intent to learn. My questions don't always reflect genuine curiosity. At times they sound more like statements. Other times they are attempts to direct the conversation so the other person says things they maybe didn't intend or want to disclose. I suspect that I've unknowingly offended people because I've overreached and jumped into what they consider private territory. This kind of question asking is the opposite of what I'm aiming for. I want my questions to be an avenue through which my neighbors feel more cared for, not less. This is where the second aspect of this practice, to learn, is so important. It builds on the practice of holding a posture of humility. It recognizes that my neighbor is the expert on his or her own experiences and life. When I'm in the position of learner, I'm acknowledging I don't have all of the answers. Relationships are by their nature a continual pursuit of understanding. Asking questions with the intent to learn helps us get there. What are we getting at anyway? The goal in asking questions is to learn. It could be to learn someone's opinion, need, or experience. It could be to learn areas of common ground or places of difference. It could be to understand their daily life, family makeup, or work interests. It could be to gauge their opinions, understand their personal history, or know their worldview. I suggest that our questions be aimed at drawing out the other person's story. Every person is larger than their politics, beliefs, or circumstances. The same defining song that sings through each of us is that we are image bearers made in the image of our Creator. Because we as Christians know that hymn of personhood that resonates through our DNA, our starting place is one of common ground. We are God's children. What I want to know about my neighbor is how this earthly, physical life has shaped them. Race, gender, and age impact someone's experience as they walk through the world. To better know who they are, I must ask questions that value their experiences. In his book, Ask More, seasoned interviewer and journalism professor Frank Sesno says, "You don't need a degree to be a disciplined listener and an empathetic questioner. You just need to know who you are talking to and be able to imagine what the world looks like through their eyes. My aim in asking my neighbors questions is to see the world through their eyes in order to love them well." As I've observed great question askers, I've learned to consider the following when drawing out someone's story. The depth of relationship. I shouldn't jump straight into, "So tell me about your son's suicide," the first time I'm introduced to someone. Trust must be built. I may ask the checker at the grocery store if she has plans for dinner, which shows I see her as a real person and not just an extension of the register. The depth of question should reflect the depth of relationship. The flow of conversation. I am not a reporter interviewing someone for the nightly news. My goal is to understand my neighbor's story so I can love them as well as possible. I try not to barrage people with question after question. I notice how they are responding. If they are expanding on their answers, they likely are enjoying where the questions are headed. If they're short in their responses, the conversation is likely entering territory that doesn't feel comfortable. What's culturally appropriate? As Sesno points out, cultural sensitivities vary widely. One person's question may be another's insult. Some cultures defer to age and authority or view public questioning as inappropriate or disrespectful. I can always start with, "Do you mind me asking?" Right there, I am showing awareness that even asking the question itself may be difficult. The art of asking questions. So how do we get to the pulse of someone's story while honoring their privacy and respecting their space? The art of asking good questions is just that. Much goes into it, from how we state the words to our inflection, body language, and context. In order to ask questions to learn, we need to keep in mind what makes a good question. Open-ended questions. These allow people to elaborate. Information-seeking questions that start with who, what, when, and where can make someone feel like they are being interviewed for a job or, worse, interrogated for a crime. Those that start with how or why get behind the story. They can get to the person's heart in the experience. For the purposes of learning about our neighbors, these are vital. Follow-up questions. When we hear a detail that seems important to the story, ask about that. How did you hear him say that? Why was that surprising? What were you thinking when you heard that news? Statements can also fall in this category. Tell me more about that. I'm interested in this. I'd love to know how you were feeling in that moment. Open-ended questions that can be starting places. What does your typical day look like? How did you decide to make this change? Who is your oldest friend? How did you meet? Who brings you joy? What brought you to this neighborhood? How did you hear about blank? Are there things you're looking forward to this week? What was your school experience? How did you two meet? How do you like to spend your Saturdays? What is your favorite thing to do with people who come to visit? How did you make blank? What made you laugh recently? What's your favorite activity on a cold day? Clarifying what you've heard. Our minds unknowingly make connections when listening. Our assumptions and biases come into play here. Asking clarifying questions makes sure we understand the other person's intent and true meaning. So, if I'm understanding you, do you mean? Later follow-up questions. Checking in with someone about something mentioned in an initial conversation shows we were listening. How did that appointment go? Did you hear from your dad? Did the storm end up ruining your tomatoes? Such questions show that we care about the details of the other person's life. Tip: set a reminder on your calendar or phone to follow up with someone about an important event. You may be the only person checking in on them about a given detail of their life. Be prepared for any answer. If our intent is learning, we need to ask questions in a way that gives our neighbors permission to be honest. This means we must prepare ourselves for things that are difficult to hear, either because of the pain, anger, or grief in our neighbor's answer, or because they create those emotions in us. Awareness of our own triggers helps us know what might make it difficult to respond in an empathetic way. Being aware of our nonverbal feedback helps as well. We want to be genuine in our responses, but at the same time, we don't want to convey shock or horror if an answer isn't what we expected. For a few years, I acted as the Angel Tree coordinator at my church. As part of Prison Fellowship, Angel Tree connects local churches to families with children who have a parent in prison. I love the program because even though the church congregation supplies the gifts, the tags are labeled from mom or from dad. Angel Tree provides a way for parents who likely feel isolated to send gifts to their children. As the coordinator, I would call the child's guardian, let them know the child's mom or dad had signed up for the program in prison, and ask if it would be okay for the child to receive some Christmas gifts from that parent. Given the complicated nature of relationships, I needed to be prepared that the answer might be no. It almost never was. If it was yes, the guardian could request one clothing item and one toy for the child. I then would pass the requests on to our congregation, who would shop, wrap, and deliver the gifts. Most of the families were sibling groups. I was in a position to hear what all of the kids in the house needed. I'm not sure why, but I was always surprised by a request for winter coats. As I made calls in early December in Colorado, it was hard to picture kids at that point in the year going to school without one. Maybe because I hear of coat drives at our school, I think every child in Colorado who needs a coat has access to one. Though I was curious, I didn't need to ask why the child didn't have a coat. I needed to know their size. I not only had to be prepared for any answer, I also needed to discern which questions were appropriate. I remember one grandmother who requested jeans for her teenage grandsons. Nothing fancy, no designer preferences, just blue jeans. I was surprised at the simplicity and unpretentiousness in the request. And then, picturing a 13-year-old boy trying to figure out life while being raised by a grandmother and needing some pants, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I was seeing just a sliver of reality in these young men's circumstances. This was not revolutionary. I have relationships with people who live in poverty. It was the specific answer to the specific question that took me aback and created an emotional response. These unexpected answers are a gift because they indicate learning is happening. They are great places to insert follow-up questions so I can better understand the answers offered. As I remember that I am asking questions with the intent of learning, I can let go of making a point, being right, or impressing somebody else. Questions are never asked in a vacuum. In order to avoid peppering a neighbor with inappropriate questions or to prevent bad timing, I can take into account various factors that will direct the conversation and the moment. I will likely be more prepared for the answers offered if I'm observing and aware of the context of the conversation. Context matters. Things to consider when asking questions. When asking questions to learn, I've discovered it helps to pay attention to three things: nonverbal communication, setting, and cultural context. Nonverbal communication. I don't think your face is conveying how you feel. Derek has reminded me many times that my nonverbal communication doesn't always match my intent. I tend to furrow my brow when I'm concentrating. This means I can appear angry or judgmental in conversation when I'm actually just focused on what the person across the table is saying. Knowing my tendencies in nonverbal communication makes me more aware of them so I can adjust as needed. Nonverbal communication can make a huge difference in how a question is received. Only 7% of what we say is conveyed through words, 38% through vocal element, tone, and the remainder through nonverbal indicators like eye contact, body posture, and so on. Though these exact numbers are often disputed, it's generally agreed that body language and tone of voice matter in communication, so it seems we should pay attention to them. Leaning your body in toward the other person, making eye contact, even touching someone on the arm if appropriate, can convey care when asking a question. Uncrossing arms and legs gives a sense of openness, while crossed arms can project hostility. Facial expression will be determined in part by the question being asked, but generally smiling and relaxing the face offers a countenance that encourages conversation. You've likely heard the expression, "People won't care how much you know until they know how much you care." The same can be true about what we say and how we say it. People won't care what you say or ask if they can't get past how you say it. With my husband, I can request, "Please take out the trash," with the kindest voice inflection or with the opposite. My tone makes all the difference in what I communicate. An exercise where you read a sentence aloud, alternating the emphasized word, demonstrates how the tone on a single word can change the meaning of the entire sentence. Try it here by listening to the following sentences. There will be emphasis on some words that you hear. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. I want you to take me to the doctor. From stressing my desire to indicating I want to see a physician over other staff, the statement itself changes meaning with the emphasis. The same is true for questions. Would you like to is a shade different than would you like to? How do we ensure our tone is warm rather than one that puts people on the defensive? It helps to breathe. When we are nervous or agitated, our body responds. We go into fight or flight mode and our breath begins to shorten. When we start to feel our hearts race, we can take longer breaths. This can be done subtly. No need to start panting in the middle of a difficult conversation. It mostly requires attentiveness to breathing and intentionally slowing it down. Speaking of slowing down, as we slow our speech and lower our voice, we can better control what comes out. We don't want to sound robotic, but we do want to be intentional about what we say and how we say it. For example, when I talk to a crying baby, my voice goes down in pitch and volume. It makes sense that all of us are more relaxed if yelling isn't involved. Smiling also helps. It warms the voice. My senior year in college, I worked in a call center outside of Seattle. Though callers couldn't see me, I was instructed to always smile when talking to the people on the other end of the phone because the warmth could come through in my voice. Granted, sometimes a grin is not appropriate, given the topic at hand, but it's a good fallback when entering a fresh conversation. Setting. Surroundings dictate what is possible and appropriate as far as conversations go. Sometimes I'm surprised that I'm indeed in the right setting to dig deeper. I've had hour-long conversations while standing in my driveway, the kind that just kept going and going. It was not the place I would have predicted for a heart-opening talk, but I can usually read the room or driveway and know whether I should keep going. Here are some questions I ask when evaluating whether a setting is an appropriate place to ask deeper questions. Are we talking about private matters? If so, do I have enough privacy, background noise, space between us and others, etc., to keep going down this road? Or do we need to move the conversation or pick up this topic at a later time when we know there will be increased privacy? Is this a comfortable place for my neighbor, or does the setting alone make them nervous or uncomfortable? I worked for a few years with high school students outside of Portland, Oregon. They were all children of migrant farm workers whose families had settled to work in the canneries year-round. Many of the parents had not attended much, if any, school. The school itself was an intimidating place for them, so I often would get in my Volkswagen Fox, yes, that was a car, and drive to the family's apartment or trailer to allow them to be more relaxed as we talked. I also learned a lot from what I observed about a family's living situation. Because I was in their spaces, they were not only more comfortable, but they also saw my willingness to make accommodations, which went a long way in those relationships. Does the setting say, "We've been expecting you"? Hospitality is about making a place for our neighbors. Whether they are standing on the front porch, coming over for dinner, or spending the night, We want to create physical spaces where someone entering feels comfortable and welcome. This is not unique to our homes. Our offices, churches, businesses, and schools can give off the vibe that this is a place for people, or not. Whether it's the language on signage or accessibility for those with limited mobility, I want my neighbor to know I have them in mind when they show up. Cultural context. Kendra and her friend Mary were taking a graduate-level class to teach English as a second language. Many of their classmates were international students getting training to take back to their home countries. When Kendra and Mary found out one of their Saudi classmates, Alanud, was expecting a baby, they shared in her joy. As the pregnancy progressed, Kendra and Mary defaulted to their typical celebration. They planned a surprise baby shower during class time. They picked a date and told everyone but the mother-to-be about their plan and what they should bring. The day before the scheduled event, another Saudi woman in the class pulled Kendra aside and told her that in her culture, it was considered bad luck to have a baby shower before the baby's arrival. What these American students meant as nothing but a generous and kind gesture unknowingly created a cultural clash. Kendra pictured the guest of honor's horror the next day when the room full of international classmates and teachers surprised her with what they believed was a celebration. Kendra decided to break the surprise and tell Alanud about their plan. Alanud understood the well-meaning intent and graciously said to go ahead as scheduled. In retrospect, had Kendra and Mary asked a few questions of their Saudi classmates, they would have chosen a post-birth date from the beginning and avoided the confusion. In an interview with the American Psychological Association, David Matsumoto, a psychologist and nonverbal communication expert, said that there are certain facial expressions associated with particular emotions across cultures around the world. However, the when and the how of expressing emotions is cultural. We may be able to tell our neighbor is happy because we recognize his laughter, but when he laughs may feel inappropriate or out of context to us because he is operating out of a cultural difference. The same is true for grief. We can recognize a sad expression, but may be confused about how someone is expressing their grief. Cultural context is important as we interact with our neighbors because it explains things that otherwise may feel confusing given our own cultural lens. This also gets back to being prepared for any response. How does all this talk about culture translate to asking questions? We must always be aware of our own cultural filter when entering conversations. This speaks to social norms, personality, which guides personal preferences, and our life experiences, which inform us about how the world works. All of these impact how we carry ourselves, our body language, and how we approach questions in the first place. Cultural context offers a larger sensitivity to how questions may be perceived and how they might inform us about our neighbor. How we form our questions also needs to be filtered through a cultural lens. In his book Leading with Cultural Intelligence, David Livermore talks about indirect versus direct communication and how it can impact the process of asking questions. Direct communicators, who are comfortable asking and answering questions, may come off as blunt and often don't take other information into account. While indirect communicators often don't ask as many questions, they may take in lots of information through observations or general knowledge. Of course, all terms are relative. What may be considered overtly direct, even rude, by one person will be fine for another. What does this mean for us as we ask questions? We need to be culturally sensitive to what may be unintentionally offensive to our neighbor. When I spoke with the migrant workers, setting wasn't the only thing I needed to take into account. There were lots of dynamics playing out in those conversations. Here I was, a young white woman who had never done hard labor in her life, telling parents they must keep their able-bodied teenagers in school during hours when they could be working to help meet the family's basic needs. I needed to consider how they viewed my position in the school, my age, and the fact that I was a woman and childless. All of these factors impacted the types of questions I asked, whom in the group I directed my questions toward, and my word choice when asking. I often asked questions to better understand the family's goals and needs. What time in the afternoon does Bianca need to be home? What do you want her to get from being in school? How did you know to come to this town for work? My conversations with mothers tended to have a better personal connection, but if the father or eldest son was in the room, the mother often deferred to them. I usually chose to follow her lead out of respect for their family system. In Spanish, there is a formal and an informal way to address someone. In many countries, the formal is no longer used, but I always addressed the parents, most of whom were from rural Mexico, where they still distinguish between the two, with the formal you. It was a cultural sign of respect. It was one small use of language that impacted how I communicated with them. The dynamics of age, race, and gender, not to mention positions of perceived authority or lack of authority, are elements we likely can't change, but being aware of them helps us to treasure the people in front of us through respectful interactions. Cultural context is also impacted by history and current events. From political movements to economic trends, larger forces outside of our neighbors' scope of control impact their experiences. Asking questions to learn can mean searching out reliable, trusted sources of information in order to understand the context of our neighbors' lives. Asking outside sources. I have a friend at church who is from South Sudan. When she stands up on a Sunday morning and asks for prayers for her mother and siblings still in her home country, she often references the latest rise in conflict. I sit and listen, somewhat embarrassed I'm not up on the latest headlines in that part of the world, but I have access to information. Current news sources, history, and professionals in a given area can help paint a larger, nuanced picture. I can find answers to some of my questions from these outside sources. Being informed about the South Sudanese conflict is one way I can show this friend that she matters to me. A decade ago, my friend Ruth joined a group from her church to make an impact on the HIV/AIDS crisis on the other side of the world. She knew very little about HIV/AIDS, so she had to ask many questions about the healthcare system, how the disease works, and which interventions prove the most effective in reducing the spread. The people she met living with the disease were the most helpful in offering personal insights, but many other sources gave her information about public health and strategic approaches to treatment. From documentaries to books, she searched out sources of information that helped her understand the disease with more depth and honesty and determine how best to use her specific talents to love her neighbors in this area. We always trust our neighbors to be the keepers of their stories. Every person is more than a trend, a statistic, or a movement. We can use outside information to help us understand context, but the person in front of us is always the primary source of their own experience. As responsible consumers, we know that much of the information we receive from news sources comes with a slant. When we are surrounded by our self-created echo chambers, we don't always get an accurate picture of an issue. So in my journey of loving my actual neighbors, I consider how Scripture directs me to behave toward them, what the fruit of the Spirit looks like, and what it means to be a hope bearer in our interactions. Often it is our neighbors and their stories that spark larger questions in us. We see disparities in the world, or our assumptions about life and people are challenged. We can turn to God with many of our larger questions. Asking Him the hard questions is both a product of and a benefit to loving our neighbors. He is also a reliable source of information, so we can freely ask. In fact, I think He's waiting for us to approach Him. Asking questions of God. I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe. I was a college student studying in Mexico, an easy thing to fit in my schedule since I was a Spanish major. My change-the-world, altruistic 20-year-old self had signed up for a service learning semester. I wanted to do good while I was there. When I arrived at the beginning of the semester, I was assigned with a few other female students to volunteer at a home for former street girls who ranged in age from 4 to 14. This was before the world of trafficking and the sex trade were talked about like they are today. I simply thought of this place as an orphanage, except the girls weren't up for adoption. It didn't occur to me that a 4-year-old could be a prostitute. The program I was on should have offered me more context as I stepped into this situation, but it didn't, and I didn't know the right questions to ask of the staff in order to better understand the girl's situation. One day I was playing with one of the younger girls. Our faces were a few feet apart, and she was smiling, present. Suddenly her expression changed. Her eyes glazed into a stare, and it was as if she was transported somewhere else, somewhere inside herself. I had a new thought, a suspicion, that the disconnect between her inner life and her physical surroundings had deeper roots than her begging for food. It was a result of serious abuse. In a moment, I had new clarity about the situation, and my heart broke wide for this girl and the world. I kept trying to play with her, engage her in the games that had made her laugh minutes earlier, but she was a different child. I didn't cry until I walked out of the building at the end of my afternoon shift. Then the tears started, and by the time I'd walked the few blocks to my host home, I couldn't breathe. My earnest why to God came from a deep place. Why this? Why these precious girls? Why not me? If ever there was a gnashing of teeth on my part, it was then. People have been asking questions to and about God from the beginning of time. When we live intertwined with people in different circumstances, belief systems, and realities, larger questions about life bubble up. Why do I have this and they don't? Or why don't I have whatever they have? From good fortune to health to material wealth, disparities become more visible and personal. The cruelty of the world becomes more tangible. We have questions about how God works and why He allows certain types of suffering and why certain people seem to carry a disproportionate load. Living out of a posture of humility, we've already established we don't have all the answers. We can ask God to reveal them to us. From everything I can tell, God is comfortable with our questions. Injustice creates anger, and God is comfortable with that too. Throughout Scripture, we read about people who questioned Him. Entire groups came to Jesus with their questions, sometimes because they wanted to catch Him saying something He shouldn't, and sometimes because they believed He had the answers. He welcomed their fears, doubts, and general misunderstandings, even their gotcha questions. In John chapter 11, we find Mary and Martha grieving the death of their brother Lazarus. The sisters had sent word earlier for Jesus to come when Lazarus was sick, but Jesus never showed. Now, days later, He walks up to their house, and both women in different moments say, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." See John chapter 11, verses 21 and 32. Essentially, in my greatest time of need, you didn't show up. Where were you? Jesus was not afraid of their questions or even upset that they asked them. He met them there, even weeping with them in their grief. He shared their pain and gave reassurance that His love for them had not changed. It's been 20 years since I asked God those questions of why that pulsed out of my heart in my Mexican bedroom. They are still part of the mystery of faith and of how God works in this world. This is not a faith with neat, tidy answers, but one that lives in the context of an often cruel and harsh world. Asking questions of God is part of my practice of asking questions to learn. I keep coming back to Him because I trust Him to love my neighbors and me. I trust His love for me so I can trust Him with my questions. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13 say, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure." This faith journey we are on is constantly working itself out. This is not earning or proving our salvation. Rather, it is an ongoing process as the gospel, the good news of God's story in the world, changes us as we live in it. We must wrestle with these hard questions if we are to mature, and it is with a mature faith we are better prepared to love our actual neighbors. A call to Saturday living. May we be people who aren't afraid to show what we don't know. May our curiosity be genuine so that our neighbors see our desire to understand their experiences and who they are. May our questions demonstrate a love that counters the sound bites and reflexive responses so common in today's world. As my pastor Steve says, Jesus walked toward people. Asking questions to learn is a way of walking toward people. Let us express Christ's concern for our neighbors through this process. By asking questions, we show that we are open to our neighbor's reality, that her opinions or his circumstances are not to be turned from, ignored, or pretended away, but to be seen as places where God already resides. As we ask questions, we are learning more about what it means to be tethered to both the world and the hope that is Jesus. May we approach God and our neighbors with honesty, always pursuing truth. Let us ask questions to learn about our neighbors and their experiences while simultaneously being sure of the hope our faith holds for today and the future, because the two are not mutually exclusive. When we stand in the reality of both, we are demonstrating that the good news of Emmanuel, God with us, is for our neighbors. This is Saturday living. Questions for reflection. 1. Who makes you feel comfortable in conversation? What does that person do that helps draw you out? 2. What do you need to be aware of, tone, body language, culture, when asking your neighbors questions? 3. How does setting impact you when you're in conversation? What do you need to consider about setting when talking with your neighbors? 4. What reliable sources can help inform you about your neighbors? 5. Do interactions with your neighbors bring up larger questions about the world? Where might you take those questions? Practicing the practice. Have a how and why dinner hour with the people you live with. Only allow questions that begin with those two words. Ask those who know you for feedback on your body language, tone, and facial expressions. Find reliable third-party sources to learn about your neighborhood's history or your neighbor's cultural context. In everyday interactions, ask questions you don't already have an answer to, and some you do. Create a welcoming space both inside and outside your living or work or ministry area to help your neighbors relax. Journal your questions for God. Scripture to digest. Psalm 119, verse 66 says, "Teach me good discernment and knowledge, for I believe in your commandments."